I didn't see this coming. And because I didn't see it coming, my happily married life ended after 22 years, 5 months, 6 days, and a shitload of hours. All because I wanted to order a fucking pizza and I was too lazy to go to the kitchen to uncharge my phone. Surprisingly, my wife's phone was on the nightstand at the other end of our couch. I say surprisingly, because it's a rare occasion when the thing in question isn't in her hand or tucked into her pocket. Especially in the last few months when she's left the room to text, let alone talk. I heard the shower water running noisily upstairs, which seemed odd for a late Saturday afternoon, but didn't pay it any mind, taking her phone to place a takeout order at our favorite pizza place. We hadn't discussed any plans for the evening, and since nothing was cooking in the kitchen, that usually meant pizza for me and an order of pasta primavera for her. Except that when I hit the back button on my phone to log in, the damn thing asked me for my password. Admittedly, I looked at the phone like it had just cursed me and squeezed it tightly in retaliation. Fuck you, iPhone, I thought, and immediately started wondering what the hell the password was. And as soon as I started wondering, a more important thought occurred to me about why it was locked. We've had identical iPhones for years, and neither of us had ever locked them before. The last time I used her phone was probably about 8 months ago to check the weather, and it wasn't locked then. I'm a pro at computers and phones, so I took the password request as a challenge. After a moment's thought, I entered the last 4 digits of her social security number, knowing that was the combination she had set for our home safe where all our important papers, like birth certificates and passports, were kept. The phone immediately unlocked, revealing a texting screen. I noticed that at the very top of the list was her best friend, Jen Jefferson, which meant that the last message before heading to the shower Tracy had texted her. I probably shouldn't have looked at the message list, knowing it was a violation of her privacy rights. But then again, she's my wife, so I didn't think it was that big of a deal if I merely looked there to see what she and Jen were texting about. Could the price of an expensive pair of shoes really be that personal? A life-changing event? The pain I suddenly felt in my chest would have knocked me over if I had been standing. I began to suck in air like a person being strangled. Everything went tumbling. I wasn't sure if I had passed out, but when I regained consciousness, I realized I had tears in my eyes and couldn't focus. Suffice it to say, I found out why my wife is a shower and that the activities planned for the evening with a certain Neville were not their first meeting. I had read through the entire conversation and was just starting to scroll through to see if there were any others when I heard the shower go silent. So I exited the app, locked my phone, and put it back where it was. Feeling like someone had just hit me in the stomach with a baseball bat, I sank down on my edge of the couch and stared into nothingness. A short time later, Tracy came downstairs and walked into the living room. She was dressed nicely, but not too sophisticated. Nice touch, I thought to myself. I was glad I didn't jump up and start choking her to death. I decided to see where this was going. "Hey, babe, I'm going out with Jen and the girls tonight. You don't mind, do you?" she asked, and innocence literally oozed from every word she said. I watched her carefully as she moved around the room. If she felt any guilt, I certainly didn't see it. "Shit!" "Don't mind, sweetie. I'll just order myself a pizza tonight and relax watching the Twins play the Rangers," I replied, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. The acting game could have been played by 2 people. "You look good, by the way. I always liked that blue dress on you. Maybe I should go with you to fend off any guys that might think wrong of you," I said. She didn't realize that I noticed her wrinkle slightly at my words. I knew the last thing she'd want tonight was my fresh ass around. "I do love him, Jen, but he's so bland," she had texted her friend earlier. "Neville is something else. Just thinking about him makes me horny." She grabbed her phone off the nightstand and headed for the exit, probably so I wouldn't have time to carry out my threat to go with her. I knew she'd meet Neville at the Red Lion for dinner, and then they'd drive to his apartment for a few hours of carnal pleasures. I wasn't seriously going to go with her, but before the end of the evening, this bland guy would definitely have to show up. Knowing I needed to kill time somehow, I leaned back on the couch and indulged in memories of my marriage. Not too long ago, I would have called our marriage perfect. I never had any idea that Tracy thought I was boring in bed or unhappy with my performance. I had always made sure she was never left hungry, and judging by her screams, I couldn't be too boring in bed. There were many questions swirling around in my head, not the least of which was how long the affair had been going on. We'd been married for 22 years, and I knew we weren't looking at a quarter of a century. I'm a CPA by profession and probably by personality, too. I'm analytical and calm, not prone to flights of fancy or anger, which probably explains why my wife thinks I'm bland. However, given that we have been married for so long and raised 2 children, she has become convinced that I can be passionate in life as well as in the bedroom. I was confused and hurt, and my anger began to heat up like a stone furnace. I knew my wife and her lover had reservations for 6 that evening, so I pulled into the back parking lot of the Red Lion at 7 to watch the door. My plan was to follow them to Neville's house, since I have no idea who he is other than his name. I remembered the first time I saw the woman who would become my wife. She was making ice cream at a Sunday event at my church, and I, like a few other guys, had an instant crush on this shapely brunette with green eyes. I had to fight my way through several other young guys that day to get a chance to talk to her, but the wait was worth it. In addition to being beautiful, she is smart and has a good command of the language. I wrote down her name and phone number that day, but I didn't call her for 2 weeks. Figured it would give all the suitors time to get out of my way. The relationship took off relatively quickly. We dated for 8 months before I asked her to marry me. 8 months after that, we were married. 2 more years after that, we had a son, Larry, and another 18 months later, we had a daughter, Delilah. Both children were already in college, which, in retrospect, may have been the beginning of the end of my marriage. I noticed that Tracy seemed a little distant from me, but when I tried to tell her about it, she said I was paranoid. Paranoia, your name is Daniel. I was shocked when Tracy walked out of the restaurant around 7:20, followed by a tall, trim young guy who looked about 20 years younger than her 47 years. I had no expectations as to what her lover would look like, but I certainly didn't expect to see a damn kid. I suppose he's handsome, though I'm hardly a good judge of males. He has a mop of curly brown hair. He looks about 14 pounds heavier and 7.5 centimeters taller than me. Considering he has my wife, I figured he had more than mine as well. I watched them kiss before getting into his car and driving away. I followed them at a decent distance, knowing that the last thing they expected was for me to follow them. In my pressed car, of course. After 15 minutes of driving, they stopped in front of an apartment building and entered the building, with the bastard leading my wife in there with his arm around her waist. A minute later, I saw the lights come on in the 3rd-floor apartment. Considering I knew they'd done this at least a few times, I didn't feel the need to rush over there instantly. I wanted to give them a chance to start and then nip it in the bud. I waited for about 15 minutes, growing more filled with anger by the minute, before I arrived at the door of the apartment I assumed was Neville's. This was confirmed when my wife shrieked loudly with ecstasy and then screamed, demanding more. "What the hell?" I'm in the hallway and I can hear her screaming while at home she acts like she's in a fucking church. "Harder, Nev! Do it harder!" she screamed. My incessant knocking on the door finally yielded a result. Neville, wrapped in a robe, opened the door looking none too pleased. It was just the 2 of us, and I took a running kick to the big bastard's nose, knocking him backward and blood pouring from his face, and a second kick to his chest, knocking him on his ass. I burst into the apartment past the prostrate bastard and rushed to what I assumed was the bedroom, finding my obviously naked wife huddled under the sheets. She'd heard our brief altercation, but didn't know what had happened or who was at the door. So when I appeared in the bedroom doorway, her eyes were as big as an owl's. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything. "Don't come home! You don't live with me anymore!" I shouted, drool flying from my mouth. "Call me back in a few days, and I'll let you come over and get your stuff." Finally, she found her voice and answered as I turned to leave. No, wait, it's not," she started, but then stopped abruptly. "I guess it is, but we need to talk." No one's ever said truer words, whore, but this isn't the time or place. The lover boy stretched out on the floor and groaned, snuggling into my arms as I was about to walk past. Still on 100% adrenaline, I kicked my foot across his unprotected sternum, hearing what I assumed were broken ribs, walked through his apartment door without closing it behind me, got in my car and drove home. I guess the rage and surprise on my part did me good, because the last time I'd fought someone was in 6th grade, and I'd gotten my ass kicked then. Neville was considerably bigger than me, but I don't think it took me more than 10 seconds to take him down on his back. Not bad for a bland guy, I thought as I drove the car into the garage. Still in a bit of a frenzy, I grabbed a bottle of Jack Daniels from my liquor cabinet and poured 3 fingers worth into a regular water glass, then started strutting around the house, smashing a few of the knickknacks Tracy had bought, throwing them against the nearest wall. Then I grabbed my favorite knife from the bedroom table and plunged it into our wedding picture hanging on the bedroom wall. I could have done more damage, but I was brought back to reality by the doorbell ringing. I can't say I was surprised when 2 police officers appeared on the doorstep. I opened the door and invited them in. The first officer waved at me in response, then, with his hand on his gun, stepped inside, followed by the second officer, also with his hand on his gun. I watched as they both scrutinized the debris I had left on the walls and floor from broken trinkets. The cops said they were here in response to a complaint from one Neville Douglas. It turned out that Mr. Douglas had been attacked in his apartment, breaking his nose and 2 ribs. Although Neville didn't know who attacked him, a woman who was in the apartment with him confirmed to the cops that it was me, her husband. I thought it was very nice of the cops not to call me her puppet husband. We realize you were completely right to beat him unconscious. But we can't let every jilted husband retaliate with his fists, the first officer told me. He wants you arrested and charged. Okay, I understand, but for the record, I didn't hit him. I only hit him twice, I said quietly, hoping that if I told the truth, I would get a lighter sentence. Both officers looked me over from head to toe and then seemed impressed. Looks like Mr. Douglas just fell for the wrong woman's husband, the second officer remarked. I acquiesced to go with the officers after they told me I had a few minutes to complete some personal business on the computer. While they watched me carefully, I transferred half of our checking and savings accounts to an account in my name only, and then paid off and closed our 2 joint credit cards. I wish I had done that from the beginning when I caught my wife cheating, the first officer said. It took almost a year before the court made her give me my share back. I had to live with my parents to survive. Well, if I'm not wrong in my assumptions, I won't have to worry about living conditions for a while. I grinned. I guess Loverboy didn't like getting his face rubbed in by a bland old man. I saw the 2 officers glance at me when they heard my cryptic statement. I didn't see fit to initiate them into the joke, whatever it was. I was at a complete loss when Tracy contested the divorce I had filed while in prison. I was going to be incarcerated for quite some time, so I figured that would be the perfect solution for Tracy. I love you, Dan. I have some feelings for Neville, but I don't love him the way I love you, Tracy said as she visited me in jail. Hey, how can you say you love me when you've been cheating on me for, I don't know how long, I asked. Neville turns you on. The thought of meeting him makes you horny. I'm just ordinary. I don't turn you on anymore. I'm just here as what? Your backup? I watched as several emotions flashed across her face, the most dominant of which was shock. She had no idea I'd seen her phone, so she was confused when I laid out her version of the text conversation with her best friend Jen that I'd seen. I didn't plan it, Dan. It just happened. He's my coworker and friend. He's a really nice guy. I think you 2 would have gotten along if you'd met under different circumstances. It's probably a good thing we shared a desk, or I might have tried to beat the crap out of her. I grimaced and growled. How long ago, Trace? Have there been others? I growled through gritted teeth. About 8 months, I think. Neville is the only one, she replied. I felt so old and out of place when the kids left. He's breathed new life into me. You and I are the same as before. The same. He's been something new, and he's full of energy, and I like that. I like him. But that doesn't mean I don't still love you. I do, and I love you very much. I don't want a divorce, Dan. It makes absolutely no sense to me. You can't have a husband and a lover at the same time. That's not how marriage works, Tracy. At least our marriage isn't. So now you're going to be in jail for a while, she interjected. Why don't you just put off the divorce until you get out of here? Think about it. While you're in jail, nothing has to change. We can make important decisions when you get out. Why did you beat him so badly, Dan? I didn't beat him up. Why does everybody say that? Prairie Boy only hit him twice, I argued. Only twice? He's much bigger than you, and younger, and healthier, she said. Rage is the great equalizer, baby. And surprise. The bastard went down like a sack of shit. She pressed her lips together and exhaled heavily through her nose. It was obvious she was thinking hard. How did you know about us? She asked. I thought we were so careful. Are you really asking me that question? I growled. She refused to sign the divorce papers, knowing I wasn't going anywhere for several years. 6 months later, I found out from my son who came to visit that she had let Neville live in our house. That same day, I got into a fight in the prison library and sent another inmate to the infirmary, earning me a month of solitary confinement. He's not such a bad guy, Dad, and he keeps Mom from feeling lonely, Eric said. If he's not such a bad guy, then why am I here and he's sleeping with that cheating whore you call your mother? I asked rather sharply. Technically, we're still married. I wanted a divorce. She refused to sign the petition. So you think it's okay for her to live with her lover? Eric made a grimace, then stood up and finished his visit. My children alternated visits, coming once a month. 6 months later, my daughter Sherry casually dropped another bombshell on me, mentioning how cute her mom looked with her growing pot belly. What the hell did you just say, Cher? I interrupted while she was babbling away. About what, Daddy? She asked. About your mom's growing pot belly. Sherry's mouth dropped open and she blushed. Oh, I shouldn't have said anything about that. Can't we just pretend I didn't say anything? She asked. Baby, you may have just handed me the keys to the kingdom, I commented. Start talking. 5 minutes later, I found out that Tracy is 3 months pregnant with Neville's baby. It seems she hasn't been taking birth control pills that regularly since I went to prison, and even after Neville moved in with her. 5 minutes after that, I was on the phone with my lawyer. The judge in our case didn't want to grant me a divorce while I was in jail because Tracy was adamantly opposed to it. But now that Tracy was pregnant with someone else's child, he changed his position and granted the divorce on my terms, absent Tracy's signature. My attorney also obtained an order prohibiting my name from being put on the birth certificate of Tracy's child. Needless to say, she was not happy, and I didn't care about her happiness. The gates opened and I walked out, finding myself free for the first time in 778 days. I still had almost 3 years of probation left on my 5-year sentence for third-degree assault, but unless I screwed up big time, I was never going back. I grinned to myself, realizing that I hadn't been completely honest with the parole board a few weeks ago. I told them that I was truly sorry for my actions that landed me in prison, and I would do everything I could to never make that mistake again. In reality, the only thing I regretted was being arrested, because if given the chance to do it again, I would do the same thing in a heartbeat, and probably even worse. Outside the gate, my lawyer was waiting for me. We shook hands, got into his car, and he drove me to my new haven, a studio apartment on the other side of town, the town where I lived when my life as I knew it was destroyed. I returned to the scene of the crime, so to speak, out of choice. I just figured it would be easiest for an ex-con to find a job here, where people knew why I'd spent time in prison. And it would be easier for me to find a job than to explain it all to someone who didn't know me. This strategy worked to perfection. 2 days later, I got a job at Wilkie Outdoor Concepts, an earthwork and landscaping company, probably because the owner is also an ex-convict. Anyway, it is a paying job, and I was happy I got it. The biggest flaw in my strategy was that I knew one day I would confront my bitch ex-wife and/or her lover and baby daddy. I would have a hard time holding back, and I really didn't want to go back to prison and serve my time. I ran my fingers over the scar from my right eyebrow to the middle of my cheek, about 7.5 centimeters across. It is a constant physical reminder of the worst stretch of my life, and that I was able to survive it. 3 years before that, I had the whole world by the balls, or so it seemed to me. I had a loving wife of 22 years, my soulmate for 22 years, 2 wonderful kids in college, a good job, and a great house. All this was before I found out that my wife had been cheating on me for several months with a much younger and larger man who had helped her get over feeling old and unwanted after our kids left home for college. A word of advice to you kids, as tempting as it may be, never hit your wife's lover. I felt great at the time, but it cost me over 2 years in prison. By the way, I broke his nose and 2 ribs. My job was basically for 3 seasons with layoffs in the winter. But when there was work, I made good money. So with unemployment, if I budgeted carefully, I could easily make ends meet. I probably could have gone back to being an accountant, hiding in the back room of someone's firm. But I really liked the physical work of landscaping and the fact that it didn't require much thought. In fact, it is almost the exact opposite of my previous work experience. After 3 years of working outside, my skin darkened and took on a rougher appearance, and I gained about 9 pounds of muscle while losing some fat. Nearing 50, I was in probably the best physical shape of my life, with noticeable abs and more massive muscles in my arms, chest, and back. My once neatly trimmed dark brown hair had turned into a shoulder-length mop of curls, which I sometimes pulled back into a ponytail on windy days to see better. I even pampered myself and got a tattoo on my left forearm, the word freshness, written in cursive and about 13 centimeters long. It served as a reminder that I needed to be less of a nice guy and more of a take charge of my life, even if it sometimes made others miserable. I'll never forget how my ex-wife blamed me in a text message to a friend, telling me that her lover was not a nice guy like me, but just took what she wanted and how much it turned her on. I resolved to be that kind of guy for the rest of my life, but I still didn't have the courage to write "fuck you" on my arm. Freshness had to serve my purpose. I got the tattoo about a year after I got out of prison. In 2 years, I had to explain its meaning about 24 times. "You're Dan Washburn, Tracy's ex-husband, aren't you?" said a very sexy voice to my left as I sat behind the bar at DeVito's place, a quiet bar 15 minutes from my apartment on a Thursday night. There were important people at DeVito's and I wasn't, so it was a good excuse for me to socialize while I watched Thursday night soccer and drank beer. Although I didn't know her that well, I recognized the woman with the sexy voice as Jen Jefferson, my ex-wife's best friend, and yes, the very same Jen Jefferson. In some ways, I blamed her for helping to destroy my marriage, though I actually realized that in her texting with Tracy, she hadn't encouraged or hindered her friend's affair. Still, it was a good old-fashioned shoot the messenger idea, because it was from those texts that I learned of Tracy's infidelity. "Yes, it's me," I replied to the tall, thin, good-looking woman. "What gave me away? The tattoo on my forearm or my forehead?" "It's probably not very well lit in here, but I can't see anything on your forehead," she said seriously while her eyes searched me. "If you look closely, there's a word written there, stooge. I thought I had a great marriage." "She thought otherwise," I said with a slight chuckle in my voice. "You look good, Jen. To what do I owe this pleasure? Do you want to rub my nose in my ex-wife's cheating or tell me I was a fool to divorce her?" I asked. I watched Jen's face turn from a smile to a grimace and then frankly ran my gaze over her body. She was wearing a dark blue floral print strappy sundress that ended about 10 centimeters above her knees, showing off her tanned skin. She was about the same age as me, and I'd have to admit that she took good care of herself. I would if the opportunity presented itself. "I can twirl in front of you if you want," she said with a slight playfulness in her voice. "Good. Let's see where this goes." I raised my index finger and made a motion for her to spin around. She did so with a smile on her face. Her sundress lifted slightly as she did so, which brought a smile to my face. "Nice, very nice legs," I said, imagining how they would look with them hugging my body. She frowned slightly, and I wondered for a second if she was reading my mind. "I realized that I was mostly Tracy's friend and you and I didn't know each other very well, but I'd like to stop by and see how you're doing. I know the last few years haven't been the best for you," she explained. "I'm doing fine now. It took a while, but almost everyone in town has been very helpful to me. By now, everyone knows the whole story, and I've gotten a lot of support. No one treats me like a criminal. Well, an ex-criminal," I said. "For the record, I wasn't excusing Tracy's affair. I knew about it, but I didn't condone it. I thought it was wrong, and you've always struck me as a decent man. I told her that she should have divorced you before having a relationship, but she kept insisting that she loved you. And if you never found out about her affair, it wouldn't hurt you. We argued over this because my ex cheated on me before I divorced him." "Have you ever thought about telling me?" I asked. She blushed heavily and lowered her eyes. "No," she whispered. "She was my friend, and I knew you only a little. I guess you could say I was loyal down to the last detail." Jen was at a bar with a couple of friends who were also singles. She invited me to join them at a table, and I accepted. The other women, Mary Jo and Allie, were also friends of my ex. We spent the evening in pleasant conversation. The only taboo topics were my divorce and my ex. "I really like your new look," Jen said at one point in the evening. "Very." "Not bland?" I interjected. "Definitely not bland," Jen said, running her finger over the tattoo on my forearm. "But you know, for some of us, bland isn't necessarily a bad thing. For some of us, it means you're a good guy. And good guys don't always finish last, if you know what I mean." She blushed slightly, and her friends smiled back. At some point, all three women dialed their numbers into my phone. Mary Jo started by cheekily asking if she could give me her number, and the others tried to keep up. 2 days later, I called Jen to arrange a date. She suggested that for the sake of fairness, I should also call Mary Jo and Ellie and ask them out. "I'm sure you won't be disappointed, and afterward, you can make an informed decision whether you want to date one, two, or all three of us," she enthused. I laughed with her and told her it wasn't a bad plan. It turned out to be a very good plan, and I had good dates with each of the women. The decision didn't come easy to me, but I decided to try Jane as someone worth moving forward with. "Are you going to keep dating all three?" she asked when I asked her out on a second date. "I would have realized that, but I was hoping you'd give me a chance to be the first to cement my relationship with you. Too explicit?" "I know that if I don't ask, Mary Jo will." "Not too much," I assured her. "On our next date, we had sex. No, that is an understatement of epic proportions. We made love for half the night. Yes, neither of us are 25, but experience and emotion gives you a lot." Almost immediately, she fell asleep in my arms. The next morning, I woke up to her ass against me again. "Freshness wins," she whispered to me a few minutes later. "Jen and I dated for 6 months before I asked her to marry me. I never asked her if she kept her friendship with Tracy or if they talked about me, because I didn't care. That part of my life was long over. She, on the other hand, at a minimum, thought about it, because when she stopped crying after I asked her to marry me, she said she would never play Tracy. One man, one woman. That's the only way. It may be bland to some, but to me it's perfect," she said. Epilogue: Tracy and Jen's relationship ended a few months after Tracy found out that her best friend was dating her ex-husband. "You stole my husband from me, you slut," Tracy accused Jen as she relayed the conversation. "No, I didn't. You gave him up. He divorced you," Jen replied. "You have Neville now." "Oh, yes," Tracy said quietly. Tracy and Neville never married, so they didn't have to divorce when he left her and their young son a few years later, I learned. As my children told me, Tracy turned into a bitch, pointing out to Neville that she didn't enjoy raising a child at a time in her life when she should be enjoying past accomplishments and grandchildren. Apparently, His willingness to take over everything in the bedroom had exhausted him, and they disagreed on many aspects of their home life. One day, my daughter told me when she came home from work, she found a goodbye note on the kitchen table. "Shit happens," I replied idly.